You know, we're really proud of that song, and it's fabulous, and we will always play it live, but some people don't want us to move on.
They were the sound of the future, robotic voices, icy synths, and a style that redefined pop forever. The Human League did not just shape the sound of the 80s, they were the sound of the 80s. But behind the glossy music videos and chart-topping hits was a story of chaos, betrayal, and survival. The band that once ruled the world would soon implode from the inside, vanishing almost as quickly as they rose. So what really happened to the Human League? How did a group that pioneered the electronic revolution nearly lose everything and somehow find a way back decades later? The truth behind their rise, fall, and strange rebirth is far more dramatic than anyone ever imagined. Before the Human League became the polished icons of synth pop, they were something entirely different. A group of outsiders experimenting with machines nobody understood. In the late 1970s, Martin Ware and Ian Craig Marsh were two friends from Sheffield, obsessed with the strange new sounds of electronic music. Influenced by Kraftwerk and early computer technology, they called their project The Future. There were no guitars, no drums, and no interest in sounding normal. Then came Philip Oakey, a hospital porter with no musical training, no band experience, and not much interest in fame. Ware invited him to join mostly because he looked the part. Oakey had a striking image, angular, mysterious, a bit alien. He had no idea what he was walking into. When the Future morphed into the Human League in 1977, the name itself came from a sci-fi board game, a nod to their fascination with machines and dystopian ideas. The early shows were raw, cold, and confusing to audiences. Their debut album, Reproduction, barely sold, and critics dismissed them as a novelty. But under the surface, they were planting the seeds of what would soon change pop forever. By 1979, the tension was unbearable. Ware and Marsh wanted to stay experimental, complex soundscapes and no compromise. Oakey wanted melody, emotion, and a more human touch. The split was inevitable. In 1980, the original founders walked away, forming Heaven 17, a slicker, funk-inspired project that would later score their own hits. That left Oakey in chaos. Half the band was gone, and their label, Virgin Records, was ready to drop them. He was 30 years old, broke, and stuck with a brand name that was already failing. But rather than quit, he decided to rebuild from nothing, and the way he did it would completely rewrite pop history. But what he did next was a risk no one in the industry could have predicted. Philip Oakey was standing at the edge of collapse when inspiration struck from the most unlikely place, a nightclub. With his band gone and a looming tour he could not cancel, Oakey needed musicians fast. So one night, he spotted two teenage girls dancing in a Sheffield club. Their names were Joanne Catherall and Sulley, both still in school. They had no musical experience, no stage background, and no idea that their lives were about to change forever. Oakey simply asked if they wanted to join the Human League on tour. The next morning, they had to convince their parents to let them go, and somehow they said yes. The tour was a disaster. Crowds booed. Critics mocked the band's new lineup, but Oakey refused to back down. He saw something in the new mix of voices, his own brooding baritone balanced by the youthful, detached harmonies of Joanne and Susan. Then he found the missing piece, producer Martin Rushent. Together, they began work on an album that would redefine pop music. Released in 1981, Dare was a perfect storm. Sleek, emotional, and unlike anything else at the time. Songs like Love Action, Open Your Heart, and The Things That Dreams Are Made Of turned synthesizers into something personal and human. But it was one track, Don't You Want Me, that changed everything. The song was almost left off the album. Oakey thought it was too pop. Instead, it became a worldwide #1 hit, selling millions and turning the band into household names. The Human League became style icons overnight. Their fashion, sharp suits, bold makeup, and futuristic minimalism defined the early MTV era. Suddenly, electronic pop was not just underground, it was mainstream, and the Human League was leading the charge. But success brought new problems. The band was stretched thin, struggling to keep up with fame and expectations. Interviews turned awkward, egos began to clash, and the creative energy that fueled Dare was already showing cracks. They had climbed higher than anyone thought possible, but behind the glamour, the tension was building again. And soon, the perfect pop machine they had built would start to fall apart from within. By 1983, the Human League was everywhere. Award shows, glossy magazine covers, sold-out arenas. To the public, they seemed unstoppable. But behind the mirror-polished image, things were falling apart. The pressure to follow Dare was unbearable. Every label executive wanted another "Don't You Want Me?" Every fan expected the next big hit. And inside the studio, the magic that once came naturally began to feel like hard labor. The next album, Hysteria, took nearly 2 years to make. Sessions stretched endlessly, with creative disagreements over every sound and lyric. Producer Martin Rushent, who had shaped their signature style, walked out halfway through. When the record finally dropped in 1984, it was met with disappointment. The sales were solid, but the spark was gone. Critics said the Human League sounded tired, like they were chasing their own success instead of leading it. To make matters worse, the mid-80s were shifting fast. New wave was fading, and electronic pop was no longer the cutting edge. MTV had opened the floodgates for newer, younger acts. The Human League suddenly felt like veterans in a race they had started. But Philip Oakey was not ready to fade quietly. In 1986, the band made a bold move. They went to Minneapolis to work with the producers behind Janet Jackson and The Time, the legendary duo Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. The result was the album Crash and the hit single Human, which went straight to #1 in America. It was a comeback, smooth, soulful, and completely different from their cold, mechanical sound. For a moment, it looked like the Human League had reinvented themselves again, but success came with a price. The new direction divided both the band and their fans. Oakey loved the polished production, but others felt the heart of the Human League was gone. Tensions flared, communication broke down, and exhaustion set in. By the early 1990s, the band was drifting. The world had moved on to grunge and hip-hop, and synth-pop was dismissed as a relic of the past. Yet even as they faded from the charts, Oakey refused to call it over. He believed the Human League still had something left to say. But the next chapter would be darker, and it would test whether the band could survive at all. Because what came next would push them closer to the edge than ever before. By the early 1990s, the Human League was a band searching for a reason to keep going. The spotlight that once burned so brightly had dimmed, and the musical landscape was almost unrecognizable. Grunge had taken over, hip-hop was exploding, and electronic pop was considered outdated. Record labels that once fought to sign them now barely returned calls. Philip Oakey, once the face of the future, found himself questioning whether there was still a place for the Human League in a world that no longer cared. In 1990, they released Romantic, an album meant to recapture their spark. It featured Heart Like a Wheel, a modest hit, but the record underperformed. Critics said the Human League sounded stuck in time. Virgin Records agreed and dropped them soon after. For a band that once defined modern pop, being cast aside felt like a quiet humiliation. But Oakey was not finished. He signed a new deal and went back to the studio, this time with producer Ian Stanley, known for his work with Tears for Fears. The result was Octopus in 1995, and it was a surprise. The single, Tell Me When, stormed the charts, reaching the top 10 in the United Kingdom. For a moment, it felt like the Human League had risen from the ashes. Their live shows grew again, and a new generation discovered their music through television and early internet forums. Still, success in the 90s was fragile. The rise of Britpop and alternative rock pushed them to the margins again. The follow-up albums came slower, each one more difficult to make. The recording process for Secrets, 2001, was particularly painful. Endless delays, label issues, and near financial collapse. But fans noticed something important. The music was raw again. Tracks like All I Ever Wanted carried the spirit of the early days, cold synths, melancholy vocals, and emotional restraint. Through the next decade, the Human League survived through live performances. They became a staple of retro festivals. But Oakey refused to treat it like nostalgia. He saw it as evolution, a way to remind audiences that electronic pop was not just a trend, but an art form. Behind the scenes, though, the toll was real. Oakey has admitted that the constant reinvention, the expectation to be the voice of the 80s, was exhausting. The pressure never really went away, it just changed shape. By the early 2000s, many bands from their era had disbanded or turned into tribute acts. But the Human League kept moving. They had weathered decades of shifting tastes, industry politics, and personal strain. And just when everyone assumed they were done, they quietly prepared for yet another chapter, one that would surprise even their most loyal fans. Because the Human League was about to find new life in a world that had finally caught up with their sound. When the Human League released Credo in 2011, few expected it to matter. The world had changed again, streaming had replaced record stores, and pop was dominated by artists who had grown up listening to the Human League. Yet, somehow, that was exactly why their sound felt new again. Bands like LaRue, Schwersche, and even The Weeknd cited the Human League as inspiration. Synthpop had returned, and now the pioneers were being rediscovered by the very generation that had once ignored them. Credo did not top the charts, but it restored something more valuable: respect. Critics noted its precision, mood, and refusal to chase trends. It was a reminder that the Human League had never been a nostalgia act. They had simply been ahead of their time. Their shows grew larger. Festivals around Europe booked them as headliners, not just heritage fillers. The sound that once felt dated was suddenly the foundation of modern pop again. Through the 2010s and into the 2020s, the Human League embraced their role as living legends. Their live performances became masterclasses in reinvention, blending minimalist stage design with massive LED visuals and laser precision sound. Younger fans, who had discovered them through streaming playlists, stood next to lifelong followers who had been there since Dare. For many, it was not just a concert, it was a time machine, a reminder that pop could be futuristic and emotional at once. In 2022, they released The Virgin Years, a box set that chronicled their groundbreaking early albums. It reignited conversations about how deeply they had shaped the modern music landscape. By 2025, the band was touring again, headlining outdoor shows across the United Kingdom, sharing stages with acts like Tom Bailey from the Thompson Twins and Blancmange. Reviews described them as effortlessly modern, with Philip Oakey still commanding the stage with that same glacial charisma that once fascinated MTV viewers 4 decades earlier. But beneath the lights and applause, there was a quiet mystery. Despite the touring, despite the renewed attention, there was still no sign of a new studio album. Fans began to wonder, was Credo their final artistic statement? Interviews hinted at endless studio sessions that went nowhere, ideas abandoned halfway, and Oakey's perfectionism keeping everything in limbo. In one interview, he admitted, "We are not sure the world needs another Human League record," and that statement left fans both fascinated and unsettled. Because for a band that built its legacy on innovation, the silence itself started to feel like part of the story. They were alive, active, and celebrated, yet somehow distant, as if protecting something unseen. But the mystery behind their quiet years, and what they have not said, may be the most revealing part of all. For a band that has spent nearly 5 decades in the public eye, the Human League remains remarkably private. No explosive scandals, no reality show appearances, no dramatic Twitter feuds, just silence. And that silence, in its own way, has become mysterious. Fans and journalists have long wondered what really goes on behind the band's clean, controlled image. Why have they not released a major new studio album in more than a decade? Why do interviews always feel like they are holding something back? Some close observers believe it comes down to Philip Oakey himself. He has always been an enigma, articulate but distant, proud yet deeply self-critical. In multiple interviews, he has hinted at burnout and creative frustration. He once admitted that making new music feels like trying to compete with your younger self. Others suggest that perfectionism has become both his strength and his cage. Songs are written, recorded, and then shelved, not because they are bad, but because they do not feel essential enough to release. There have been quiet rumors of creative tension within the group, not open conflict, but a long-standing difference in direction. Oakey's vision has always leaned toward minimalism and artistic control, while Sulley and Joanne Catherall prefer a lighter, more performance-driven approach. The trio has described themselves as a business partnership rather than a close-knit family, and that practicality has kept them stable, but also distant. They travel together, perform together, and then return to separate lives. Behind the scenes, there are also whispers about missed opportunities, unreleased material, collaborations that fell apart, and projects quietly abandoned. At one point in the mid-2000s, there were talks about an album produced by a major electronic artist, but it never materialized. No one has ever explained why. Fans have scoured interviews and old studio notes for clues, piecing together fragments of songs that never saw daylight. The result is a sense that the Human League's greatest mystery is not what they released, but what they did not. And yet, maybe that restraint is what has preserved their mystique. Unlike many of their contemporaries, they never overshared or diluted their legacy with endless comebacks. They appear, perform flawlessly, and vanish again, as if stepping out of time itself. Philip Oakey once said, "The Human League has always been about control, controlling sound, image, and emotion. Perhaps silence is simply the final form of that control. Still, questions linger. Is there a final album sitting unfinished somewhere? Is Oakey waiting for the right moment, or has he quietly decided that the story is complete? No one really knows, and the Human League is not offering answers. But maybe that's what makes them timeless. The idea that even now, after 40 years, we still do not fully understand them. The story of the Human League is not just about fame or the 80s or even music itself. It is about persistence, the refusal to disappear, even when the world moves on. From the freezing rehearsal rooms of Sheffield to global superstardom, from near collapse to quiet endurance, their journey mirrors the rise and fall of pop culture itself. Every decade brought a new version of the Human League, one built not on nostalgia, but on survival. Their influence runs deep. You can hear echoes of their sound in modern electronic artists, in movie soundtracks, and in the DNA of pop itself. Yet somehow, they have remained slightly out of reach, mysterious, measured, and untouched by time. Maybe that is why people still ask, what really happened to the Human League? Because in a way, the answer keeps changing. The story is not over. It is simply evolving in silence. And maybe that is what makes them unforgettable. They defined the sound of the future, then lived long enough to see that future catch up. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Human League's rise, fall, and quiet rebirth, make sure to like this video, drop a comment with your favorite Human League song or memory, and subscribe for more stories about the artists who shaped music history. And if you want more behind-the-scenes legends like this one, share this video, because every view helps keep these untold stories alive.